Thanks for coming this evening. We appreciate it. Welcome to a fireside chat with Uncle Al. We do in fact have we are in a fireside location, but there's no actual fire going right now. Unfortunately, the gas has been capped off. We're going to hope that Dr. Buris, as new head of the HRC, can get us a real fire here at some point in the future. Okay, so it's my belief that when somebody knows something about the history of something they've been given, its price and the sacrifices made for it, they're more likely to care for it and to pass it on. And anybody in this room that has any serious connection with Christian philosophy or philosophy as a Christian has been given something. Part of the goal tonight is for those individuals to get a better picture of what that thing that they've been given cost, the sacrifices that have been made for it, and to learn a little bit of the story that they're a part of, to realize that they're a part of a bigger story than they might realize. And so we've assembled an esteemed panel here tonight, consisting of Dr. Alvin Plantinga, who recently retired from Notre Dame, 53 years as a professor overall, 28 of which were at Notre Dame, and 18 of which were at Calvin College.
19.
19, all right. Don't want to leave it. Don't leave off a single year. And then we have two members of our own faculty, Dr. Steve Evans. If you want to say how long you've been a professor, that's okay. If you don't, how long have you?
40 years.
40 years? Very good. And how long have you been here at Baylor?
10 years.
10 years, okay. And then we have the chairman of our department, Dr. Michael Beatty. And Mike, I know you graduated from Notre Dame in 1987, so we can calculate from that.
Well, actually,
is that right?
I began teaching at at Ouachita with only a master's, something that wouldn't be possible now.
Mm-hmm.
And I taught there from 75 to 81.
Okay, so you taught at Ouachita Baptist for 6 years before.
Then went to Notre Dame for 3. Then went back to Ouachita with all but the dissertation completed. So calculate it that way.
Yeah, and your master's was from Baylor, right?
So not as long as these two guys. They're much older than I, but I've taught a while too.
So the way I want to get the ball rolling, and we'll open up, we'll do a little bit of history here, and then we'll open up the floor to questions of any matter of interest. But the goal here is to also realize that the philosopher is not just an individual who can write books from which we can learn things, but also a source of wisdom for a way of life. And Dr. Plantinga is well known not just for the insights that you can get from his books. Philosophers have disagreements. Dr. Plantinga and I have, and others here have a lot of disagreements in the things that we write in our articles, but nobody questions the wisdom of the man, and that's one of the things that he's most known for. Is not just
with a possible exception of my wife.
Yeah. She asked me to read this letter. She couldn't be here tonight herself, so she asked me to read this in her stead. And so I hope that at least some of the questions will not just be of the form, what do you think about this, or what do you think about that, or what is your view on this, but also questions seeking to elicit wisdom from a lifetime spent as a Christian academic. So having said that, but your questions about philosophical matters are obviously perfectly welcome as well. Having said that, let's get the ball rolling. So we can go back farther into your childhood if you'd like, but you've recently retired and are now back at Calvin College doing a little bit of teaching and writing, but you're coming back to a place not just that you taught at previously, but at where you got originally your undergraduate degree.
Right. Uh-huh.
And recently, when I was up in Michigan, you gave the Gelma lecture.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about him and what an influence he was on you?
Well, I went to Harvard I'll start back a little bit earlier than that. When I was an 11th grader, my father was a professor of philosophy, psychology, and some other things at Jamestown College in Jamestown, North Dakota. So I was going to a high school there, and he thought I wasn't learning anything, and he therefore made me quit high school after the 11th grade, which didn't suit me at all because I was really interested in high school sports, and I would have been, you know, I was on the football team, the basketball team. So I did not like the idea of not having my senior year, but in those days you did what your father told you to do. At any rate, I did. So I went to Jamestown College for one semester, and then to Calvin College the second semester, because at the semester break, my father left Jamestown College to go to Calvin College to teach. Nobody who was a Calvin graduate in those days and was asked to come back to Calvin to teach ever said no. It wasn't really a possibility at all. So then I did that. Well, during that year, I applied to go to Harvard. I applied for a fellowship at Harvard, which I got. So the next year, which was officially my freshman year, I went to Harvard, and I enjoyed Harvard a lot. I had learned a lot of things, ran into people of a very different sort from any I had ever run into before, and took 3 philosophy courses and decided knew I was going to be a philosopher, which I already knew quite a bit earlier on. And during the spring term of that year, I went back, the year I was at Harvard, I went back to Grand Rapids, where my parents were, and because Harvard's spring vacation and Calvin's didn't match, Calvin was in session, and I went to 3 classes that Harry Jellema taught. Harry Jellema, Jellema, and I was just swept away. I mean, I thought this is a guy I want to study philosophy with, and I was sort of primed to do that because my father had also been a student of Harry Jellema, and I'd heard about Harry Jellema often when I was growing up. So I decided, then okay, I'll go to Calvin, and I did, and I studied with Harry Jellema. I remember one course in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. The 2 students in it were myself and Nick Walterstorff. We were the only 2 students in that class, and well, I mean, I found Jellema just. If he told me black was white, I would have had a real intellectual struggle. Fortunately, he never did that. And I had enormous respect for him ever since. And so a while back, my wife and I, quite a few years ago, like 20 years ago, decided we were going to try to raise money for William Harry Jellema Chair in Christian Philosophy at Calvin. And we worked at that for a long time, and we weren't very successful. I mean, we had to raise $1 million, and the college would raise the other $1 million. Well, it's pretty hard to raise $1 million if all your friends are academics. You ask them for a contribution, and they send you, $15 or something. Well, think how many $15 checks you need to get to $1 million. And finally, after a long time, we had gotten up to, how many is it?
I was going to calculate.
Finally, after many years, we had gotten up to 600,000, and then this Texas oil man, who had been a student of Jellema too, called up and said, well, he would like to take care of the rest of it, which he did, just like that,
What's his name?
I think I better keep that under my hat.
We wouldn't mind having the Plantinga chair at Baylor.
Anyway, I don't know if that answered your question, but that was
well,
in the neighborhood.
Yeah, well, it suggests the further question of you must have faced some, at least someone must have questioned the wisdom of leaving Harvard. I mean, it seems like a good place to be.
Yeah, my advisor was Raphael Demas, who was a well-known Plato scholar, and he thought I was insane. He'd never even heard of Calvin. Here I was at Harvard, getting good grades and taking philosophy courses from him, as a matter of fact. And I wanted to leave Harvard to go to this college he never heard of on the shores of Lake Michigan somewhere.
Now, would this have been a time when, Harvard had some pretty big names, some important figures?
Yeah, in those days it was, Quine and D.C. Williams and Raphael Demas and I don't know. I mean, I can't remember who. This was in the 50s.
Yeah.
I don't remember who else.
So when someone suggested, this is irrational. You're leaving an excellent, well-known, historic school for some, backwater Dutch Reformed place that nobody's ever heard of. What do you offer that person as a reason for doing that?
Well, I don't remember what I told Demos, but I'm delighted I went to Calvin, and I think who knows how. Questions about how you would or wouldn't have turned out, if things had gone differently, are really hard to answer. But I don't think I would have. I'm sure Christianity would not have played as large a role in my life if I had stayed at Harvard and instead of going back to Calvin. I mean, at Calvin, Calvin is a college of the Christian Reformed Church. The Christian Reformed Church is an immigrant Dutch Calvinist church. So it comes from Dutch Calvinism. There's Scottish Calvinism on the one hand and Dutch Calvinism on the other. The church I grew up in, or not exactly, but my parents grew up in, and that I was in when I was at Calvin, is that sort. And one of the most important figures in the history of Dutch Calvinism is Abraham Kuyper. How many of you heard of Abraham Kuyper? Right, a lot of you have heard of him, right? And Abraham Kuyper was, in those days at Calvin, and still now too, a source of inspiration. People talked about him all the time. They wanted to be Kuyperian. The whole idea was to be Kuyperian, one way or another. And that was also Jalama's idea. And Kuyperianism involves essentially thinking of all of life, all of scholarly life in particular, as one way or another closely connected with religion, either with true religion, Kuyper said, or with false religion, some other kind of religion, naturalism, let's say. Well, that's how Jalama thought of things, and I caught that sort of idea, that vision from him, and that's what I've thought ever since.
Yeah.
Right.
So 2 quick follow-up questions before we move forward in time. One is, were you and Nicholas Waldersdorf in the exact same class, or were you a bit off from one another?
I think he was a year ahead of me, if I'm not mistaken.
Do you remember when you first met him? Like, did you know him before Calvin?
No.
So you met him at Calvin?
I met him at Calvin. I think we were both sophomores when we met, so he's the same class.
Okay. Was it in a philosophy class, or was it outside of class?
I think maybe it was in a philosophy club, Plato Club.
Oh, really?
Undergraduate
Plato Club.
philosophy club, right? Yeah.
Well, that's a good segue to my second follow-up, which was, I remember reading somewhere that you were reading Plato while working in the fields or something when you were high school.
No, it wasn't exactly working while I'm working in the fields.
I just picture you, with your hoe, your copy of Plato right there.
But my father was trying to teach me Latin and Greek and had me read Plato when I was in high school, when I was like 14 or so. Yeah.
So you graduate from Calvin in 1954, and then you go to the University of Michigan, still within your home state, but I assume then also a large public school with a very different character than the small private school. And there, at that time, teaching is William Alston, right?
Yeah.
So
and also William Frankena, who
yes.
was also a West Michigan Dutch person, like myself.
Yeah. So in the same year in which, in the same basic time frame in which Dr. Plantinga retired from Notre Dame, William Alston passed away. And one of the reasons why I feel it's important at this time to take a look back at the history of Christian philosophy in the latter part of the 21st century is because with the retirement and death of 2 major figures in this movement, that
well, so far we've got one death here.
I'm sure you'll be with us for a long. This guy, I'm up at Notre Dame this year, so we flew out of the same airport in Grand Rapids, and we had a 2.5 hour layover in Dallas. So we go to have a nice meal and go over to the D wing, and then we go in plenty of time over to our gate, and then we realize there's nobody else here. And so we take off running, and he goes down an escalator. And I'm thinking, wow, he's going pretty fast. And then he starts going faster. I'm like, I'm a runner. I can go fast as that. But then I had to go really hard to go as fast as he was going down this escalator, like running.
When you get to be my age, everything is all downhill.
And when I was finishing at Rochester, which is not far from Syracuse where Alston was, a lot of people came through to sort of pay their last respects to Bill, and they would often stop in and see Ed Waringa, my mentor at Rochester. And before we talk about Alston's influence on you at Michigan, I think Steve, Dr. Evans, had something he wanted to say as well.
Well, I actually let's wait on that till
Okay.
we talk about the SCP.
Okay, right. So part of the narrative here, this is going to involve the origination of the Society of Christian Philosophers, which is something that a lot of people in this room are members of, and the journal that started. So you go to University of Michigan, and how did you just have a class with Alston? Did you know of him before you went there?
I think he might possibly have been at Calvin once before, but I'm not sure. But I had 3 classes with him in the year and a half I was at Michigan. And I appreciated him greatly, but more later on. I mean, Alston was a Christian when I first met him, but a very sort of filled with doubts, tentative, hesitant. And then personally, he was also sort of closed in, and it was not really easy to talk with him. I wanted to talk with him. I'd go in and talk to his office, and basically it'd wind up we would just be sitting there, without much to say. But then in 1975, I think it was, at least right around that time, he was in Oxford, and he went to Evensong regularly. He went to Evensong in Christ Church College in Oxford. He had a powerful religious experience, and his whole life was transformed. He was a different person after that. He was much more, well, first of all, he wasn't a doubtful Christian. He was a very serious, confident Christian, and he was personally much more sort of opened up and not defensive and not worried about himself or what people would think of him like that. He was just quite it was the same guy. You could certainly tell it was the same guy. It wasn't like like you couldn't even recognize him, but there was a substantial difference. And after that, he became a real leader in Christian philosophy. It was the Society of Christian Philosophers, the formation of that was his idea, and then he co-opted some of the rest of us into it. And the same for starting the journal Faith and Philosophy, of which he was the first editor. Not only was he the first editor, I've never seen anybody, with a possible exception of Eleanor Stump, who could work as hard as Bill Alston. I mean, he would get these papers, he'd send them out to be refereed, but he'd also read them all himself and sometimes send them back as many as 3 or 4 times for more changes and improvements, and then finally publish them. So he spent an enormous amount of time doing it.
Yeah, I'd like to add just a remark or two about Bill. Before doing that, let me just I'd like to, as a sort of backstory, I want to say something about the relationship between Wheaton and Calvin, since I'm a Wheaton person.
A Wheatonian.
I first recall, and I'm sure even as a student at Wheaton, we had an annual conference in those days. They had a kind of called the Wheaton Philosophy Conference, and most years the Calvin philosophers came over to that conference. So I became aware they were often ostentatiously smoking on the sidewalks. In those days, we didn't know smoking was bad for you, I guess, back then, right?
Well, Wheaton did. I mean, it was prohibited on the campus.
Yeah.
But it didn't prevent you from doing it.
Well, actually, it did. Yeah, we'd rush off the campus.
When I arrived at Calvin, one of the old guard in the faculty in the history department was talking to me, and he knew I was a Wheaton person, and he said, "You know, what I really resent is those blankety-blank fundamentalists who are right about smoking."
I never heard that. Who was this?
It was the brother of Dale Van Clay.
Ed Van Clay, right. Yeah, that's right.
But anyway, so there was this sort of interchange between Wheaton and Calvin, and even as an undergraduate, but even more after I came back to teach at Wheaton, Art Holmes, my mentor there, talked at great length about the Calvin philosophy department, and they had the Calvin people had a tremendous influence on Art. In fact, he taught Abraham Kuyper at Wheaton, so we were all, in a sense, influenced by the Calvin example, and it was very, very powerful. So anyway, I come back to Wheaton as a faculty member after doing my PhD, and in 1976, after Bill Alston has come back from Oxford, we invited Bill to be the main speaker at the annual Wheaton Philosophy Conference. And he did a great job. He was a different person. I had met Bill Alston before too, and he was a completely different person. And after the conference, Bill sat down with Art Holmes and myself, and he said, this was the best experience of my life in terms of a conference. And what I want to do is I want to institutionalize this. I want to create an organization that will allow us to reduplicate this experience. And I think
was that, Steve?
That was in 1976. And right after that was when he proposed, I think it was the year, it was 78 when this is SCP?
His official founding was 1978.
1978. It was
Right,
during the school
yeah.
year 78. I know that year because I was not at the first meeting. I remember hearing about it, but I was in Denmark. That was my year. I was in Denmark writing my first big book on Kierkegaard, so I missed the first founding meeting, but I was well aware of it. But anyway, I thought that little anecdote about Bill and Wheaton and so on was worth sharing.
Yeah, right.
And it's relevant to the growth of the vision for Christian education that brings us to contemporary Baylor and Mike Beatty's yeoman's work in putting forth the ideal of an integrated Christian philosophy, and in particular one at an institution that would have a PhD program, and then to generate individuals to go out and teach in colleges and universities, and so that's just right there, right in a row. You've got the sort of ascendancy of a sort of approach to Christian philosophy and Christianity and philosophy.
Yeah, let me say a little
Yeah.
word about that to connect some dots even more explicitly. As I say, I got a master's in philosophy from Baylor and went back to Ouachita and began teaching in 75. While I certainly never expected to be a philosophy major when I transferred from West Point to Ouachita. In fact, my pastor had warned me, beware of atheists, communists, and philosophers. So when I was required to take that first philosophy class, you can imagine that this missionary Baptist was a little bit worried about it. But I got in there to the class, and I found the subject matter so very compelling, and it seemed to me certainly to be congruent with religious impulses that were alive in my life and were one of the reasons that I transferred from West Point. But at the same time, Baptist life, especially as I experienced it at Ouachita and I think beyond Ouachita in the South, is largely pietist in nature, which means that faith is largely a matter of the heart. That was one of the reasons that you might beware of philosophy, because that means you have to think about things. And so there was a kind of split between the heart and the mind, except when you're studying things that are more concrete and practical. So lots of Baptist schools are quite happy to emphasize having a school of business and doing well in the sciences so you can go to med school, but theology and philosophy and that sort of stuff people get worried about it. It's either impractical or dangerous. And yet, I found philosophy really compelling and got a master's at Baylor and came back to teach. But what I'd learned was that if you were really going to be a good philosopher, you still had to keep these things sort of separate. Even though my impulse was in that direction, that was what my teacher at Ouachita emphasized. There was a bit of that here at Baylor as well. And so I was still trying to figure things out. And Mark Coppinger, who was a graduate of Ouachita Baptist University, had gotten a PhD at Vanderbilt, was now teaching at Wheaton. And in 1980, he invited me to bring a group of students to the Wheaton Philosophy Conference. And I did. And there were a bunch of Calvin folks at the conference. And when we began to talk about graduate schools, the suggestion was that if you really wanted to get a good degree in philosophy, but one that was sympathetic to one's Christian commitments, go to Notre Dame. After all, Alvin Plantinga was teaching there. Now, he was only adjunct, or teaching one course a semester.
Yeah, one seminar, one seminar semester.
A semester or years.
Yeah, right, maybe it was a year.
Yeah. And so I went to Notre Dame. And it was there at Notre Dame, especially influenced by Al, but many others as well, and with the influence of Nick Wolterstorff at Calvin, that I began to see that faith and learning, I mean, it's an old tradition. Just, how I could be so uneducated is a part of the story, right? But it was there at Notre Dame that I began to have the opportunity to think about these things differently. So I'm forever in the debt of the Wheaton Annual Conference, the way in which it brought providentially folks from Wheaton and Calvin together, and eventually me to have an opportunity to study with folks who think that faith and learning are mutually enhancing.
Yeah, in the days before there was an SCP and SCP meetings regionally and at the conventions, the Wheaton Conference was a kind of once-a-year reunion for Christian philosophers. And not only did the Calvin people come over, but people like Keith Yandell were always there. George Mavrodes was virtually always there. A lot of other people came in, and it was a really important. It served a really important function at that time for me, both as an undergraduate when I came back. I think what I learned from interacting with the Calvin people and other good people, one of the things I learned was just that I didn't have to be apologetic or anxious. It seemed to me that the Calvin philosophers, unlike the Wheaton philosophers, had a sense of confidence and a sense of being rooted in a tradition. They knew who they were, where they were coming from. They didn't feel like they had to prove themselves. They could be themselves. So when I went off to Yale, I still had a little bit of that feeling of, I got to show that this little fundamentalist kid is smart. I had to try to impress people. But as long as you're trying to impress other people, you're not really going to be yourself. And I think what I admire, what I got most of all from Al and Nick and a lot of other good people at Calvin too, a lot of the colleagues there, people like Cliff Orlebeke and Rich Mao was there in those days.
Right, yeah.
Was this sense of stand in your own shoes and be rooted in your faith and be bold enough to sort of think from that perspective. and obviously do the best thinking you can do, but that's, I think, the most valuable lesson that I learned.
And that takes us back to one of the threads that I wanted to emphasize, which was this idea of confidence and the sort of confidence is confidence in oneself or in how one is situated with respect to something that is potentially threatening too. And you talked about the little bit of insecurity or anxiety on the part of some of the Wheaton philosophers. So you get to Michigan, it's big, secular. You've got Alston at this point is still in a more of a doubtful condition. Now Franken, as I understand it, was a committed Christian, but not very vocal in any way. Is that right?
Not at all. Right. It never showed up in his teaching at all.
Yeah, and was Mavrodes at Michigan at that time?
No, he was not. He was. I think he had just left as a student.
Okay. All right. So
he and I were about roughly the same age, so
okay.
He wasn't a professor there then.
All right. So did you find? I mean, I'm assuming at Calvin you could speak from your faith in class and not face any sort of opposition.
Yeah.
But what about at Michigan when you get there?
Well, there it wasn't the done thing at all, with respect to that confidence thing, a lot of that came from Harry Jellema, who he had this kind of magisterial vision of all of the whole history of philosophy. He talked about these three minds: the ancient mind, the medieval mind, the modern mind, and he stood, of course, in this Kuyperian tradition, which was always self-confident and probably too self-confident. I mean, Dutch intellectuals are often a little more self-confident than they really should be than the facts warrant, and that was true of Kuyper, and it spilled over into. I don't say that Jellema was more confident as an intellectual than he should have been, but I mean that sometimes happened. In any event, he wasn't cowed by modernity at all. I mean, it seemed to us students that he understood the inside of modernity better than any of the modern philosophers themselves did, and he didn't find this any source of any kind of threat. This is the kind of world we live in, and we Christians have got, here's how we think about it. That's of course, we think the right way to think about it. I mean, if you think about it as something a certain way, you're likely to think that's the right way to think about it. And so I never had any sort of feelings to the effect that Christian thinking was inferior, or that Christians had to be sort of keep a low profile or anything like that. And a lot of that came from the Dutch Calvinist tradition, probably also in the Scottish Calvinist tradition, but anyway in the Dutch Calvinist tradition through Harry Jellema.
And at this time, probably most Catholics are still going to Catholic schools more exclusively.
Right.
But what about the reception of those ideas? First of all, what about your peers? Did you see anything like this same sort of confidence in your peers? And did you attempt to, in your classes, address the problems that were set in front of the class from a Christian perspective? And how was that?
No, I don't think I did. I'm trying to think what classes I had at Michigan, but no, I didn't do that. I wasn't trying to change the world. I was just kind of going with how things were done there. And
so, was it any different at Yale? So, in 1955, you graduate from Michigan, and then you go to Yale.
Right.
Was there much difference in the sort of intellectual climate between Michigan and Yale?
Well, I went to Yale because at Michigan I thought things were too dry, too analytic, and too sear, not enough metaphysics in the grand style. So I asked Franken where to go to study metaphysics in the grand style, and he said, well, Yale, he said, but he wouldn't advise going there. But he did say that's where it was done. So I went there and studied metaphysics in the grand style a la Yale, and I soon came to, I lost a lot of faith in metaphysics in the grand style. One of my professors was Paul Weiss, who I don't know how many of you have heard of Paul Weiss, but he was He was an extremely energetic little guy, you know, when I knew him, he was about 60 years old. And he's always running around, and he's also a very ardent self-promoter who told me that every good dissertation had a chapter on Paul Weiss in it. So I wrote a chapter on Paul Weiss in my dissertation. And when I first got there, I thought, I was in Weiss's classes, and I thought, it felt like there's something really impressive and important going on, and if I could only I couldn't quite get it, but if I could, I thought this would be, you know, really great. And I'd go home and try to write it down, and I never could, you know, I couldn't think of much of anything, really. And after a couple of years of that, I just sort of got discouraged about philosophy of that sort. My other main professor was Brand Blanchard, whom some of you no doubt have heard of. He's an idealist, and he was a real British gentleman, although he was actually born and brought up in Ohio. Somehow he managed to be a real British gentleman. And but at Yale, everything was carried on at much too high a level of abstraction to suit me. I mean, so in a course in Blanchard's course in metaphysics for graduate students, one session would be on God, another session would be on universals, another would be on causality, another would be on space and time and so on. So for each of the really big main questions, you know, there'd be just one session, and we never. And then Blanchard would say, well, there's the ancient idea about this, and there's Kant's idea about this, and then there's the idealist idea about this. So there'd be 3 or 4 main approaches to this great big question also in the same class, and then he'd finally wind up with the idealist approach, which he said he thought was the right one. So there's never any, I never got any feeling about how actually to do philosophy, how to do it, you know. I mean, there's just great big questions and great big enormous vistas, but no sort of getting into things and trying to really figure them out. But from the point of view of Christian influence there really wasn't any, and I didn't provide any myself either. I mean, I didn't tell people that we should do things the way Harry Jellema or Abraham Kuyper did. I don't think that would have.
At that point, did you have an instinct to approach the problems of philosophy specifically from within the Christian worldview, or how did your Christian worldview at least at that time?
That really came later when I went back to Calvin.
Mm-hmm.
When I was a graduate student, I basically was just trying to learn what I was being taught, and I wasn't. And I had in the back of my mind all the time, you know, that the proper way to do philosophy, which I didn't think I knew how to do, was to see philosophical questions from a Christian perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't do any of that in graduate school. That really, I started thinking about that really seriously as an adult, not as a college student, when I started teaching at Calvin.
Even before that, though, some of your first publications at least touch on matters of philosophy of religion, stuff on the ontological argument, necessary being. At that point in time, when you thought, well, maybe I'll write something on the ontological argument or on the goodness of God and send it to the Australasian Journal, what gave you the confidence to do that, or when did you start thinking? I mean, apparently not long after grad school, you did start thinking about advancing arguments within the philosophy of religion.
Yeah, I guess I started that. I mean, I started teaching a seminar in philosophy of religion at Wayne University, and it was there that I started.
Mm-hmm.
That I started off in thinking about philosophy of religion. But that's a little different from thinking about philosophy in this Kuyperian fashion.
Mm-hmm.
So what I was doing at Wayne University was basically fighting off my colleagues, all of whom were extremely talented and atheists, like Ed Gettier and Robert Slade and Hector Castaneda and Richard Cartwright and the like. And so I was doing philosophy of religion, but I wasn't doing what I think of now as Christian philosophy. Mm-hmm. Right.
Now I know from other stories that you had good relationships with those guys.
I did, right. I
So,
liked them a lot.
in fact, when was it you said you and Slay would race one another?
We did that much of the time we were there.
It's like literally they would have a mile race, right?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't just on a city street, it was in the gymnasium, in a kind of, in a great big building that had a track on the second floor, kind of sharply banked track around the corner, you know. That's what we raced on.
How many laps was a mile in that track?
I think it was 12.
Oh my God.
So,
Oh, man.
so we were turning.
Were you
really
dizzy when you were done?
We were sharply inclined nearly all the time.
Well, go ahead and tell them what your times were.
Well, we'd be around 5 minutes or so.
This is when he's a assistant and young associate professor. Okay, so you had a good relationship with these guys, and you had a relationship with them outside of philosophy. So what did these attacks look like? You said you were defending yourself against them. So what did this look like? What were the nature of the attacks? What were the content of the attacks?
Well, they were always saying that there wasn't any evidence for Christian belief or for belief in God at all, that there were these powerful arguments against it, the argument from evil. And our chairman, Nikian, who had recruited me by claiming on the phone, well, he'd call me up every week or so when I was or every other day when I was at the end of my time at Yale University. He would call me up and he'd ask about my son Carl, who had the measles, how Carl was doing, and express great admiration for Dutch Calvinism, which was a complete lie, really. He hated Dutch Calvinism. He hated Christianity of any sort. And then later on, at Wayne, we'd have parties, you know, and George would have a couple of drinks, maybe 3 or 4 drinks. Everybody would have a couple of drinks, and George would start hollering, saying, nobody with even one functioning neuron could possibly be a Christian, you know, carry on that way. And then Slay would say, well, George, what about Al? Don't you think he's got at least one functioning neuron? And George would say, well, yeah, but there's got to be a screw loose in there somewhere. So that's what it was like. I mean, Slay and Gettier were not aggressive about their anti-Christianity or atheism. But Castaneda, Hector Castaneda, whom I don't know how many of you heard of him, but he was a very able guy who died relatively young. He was very aggressive about it. So I spent my time there, my intellectual time, apart from teaching, sort of defending myself against these attacks, on the one hand. And on the other hand, learning to do philosophy in what I came to think of as the right way, that was on the other hand. I mean, there were these 3 people were particularly important in my growing up there. Gettier, who came from Cornell and had studied with Norman Malcolm and was a kind of Wittgensteinian. Castaneda, who came from Minnesota and had been a student of Sellers, so he was a Salesian. And Slay, who had come from Brown, where he studied with Chisholm, so he was a Chisholmian type. And our first years at Wayne were taken up pretty much with sort of fighting out which one of these people was right. Was it Chisholm, or was it Sellers, or was it Wittgenstein? And Chisholm finally won out. So by the end after 2 years or so, maybe 3 years, we were all basically Chisholmians. So there were these 2 sides of what was going on with me in that time. On the one hand, I was always trying to defend Christianity. I was very much in a defensive mode. And on the other hand, I was sort of learning how to do philosophy and what I came to think of was the right way. Yeah.
And then you go back to Calvin.
Yeah.
Just answering the call, I guess, is
Right.
applying the rule that Calvin grad invited, Calvin goes to Calvin.
Exactly.
And
Right.
it's during your time at Calvin, from 63, 64 to 82, before you go full time to Notre Dame. It's during that time period that Alston has his conversion.
Yeah.
That that the Society of Christian Philosophers gets started.
Right.
That the journal Faith and Philosophy. How long after the formation of the society did the journal start? Was it fairly?
Well, it was almost immediately.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Right.
Dr. Evans, Steve, you've been a president of the Society of Christian Philosophers. What year was that?
I was teaching at Calvin, so it would have been sometime between 1994 and 2002. I'm guessing
Okay.
around 1997 or
Okay, so in the 90s.
98.
And then then in '82 you go full time to Notre Dame. It's during that time that Mike Beatty is there, and also another professor of ours who's traveling today, John Quanvig, also was at Notre Dame at that time. And it's during that time that the Bellingham conference occurred. That was 1980.
Oh,
It's
that
86.
summer
Summer
seminar.
seminar.
Yeah.
Summer seminars, 1986, a really terrific summer
Were you
seminar.
there?
You've forgotten?
You get to a certain age and you just can't remember the pivotal moments, right?
Yeah,
So, Dr. Beatty, this was a very, very huge event also. So this is almost 10 years after the formation of the Society of Christian
was.
Philosophers.
Yeah, exactly.
And yet,
76 to 86.
yeah. So, and it was a time, from everything that I've heard, where it was another boost of energy along the way in this movement, and many other people whose names students of Christian philosophy and philosophy in general know those names as people were there. Can you say a little bit about what the environment was like there at the
It
Bellingham?
was very intellectually stimulating on the one hand, and also very communally. It was a terrific community. Bill Alston and Al Plantinga were the co-directors.
yeah.
There was a terrific lineup of invited guest speakers. I dare say I can't remember all of them, but for example, Eleanor Stump came and spoke. Richard Swinburne spoke.
Bob Adams.
Spoke. Gosh, it was you had a terrific lineup.
So-
And
some
then
of the
you've
other
got a
people-
lot of folks who are now senior faculty at institutions who are doing really good work, but were like me, participants in the conference. So Linda Zagzebski
Yeah,
was
she was
there.
there.
Ed
Yeah.
Waringa was there. Bill Haskers was there. Steve Weikstra was there, and you go on and on. So on the one hand, you had terrific topic. Well, you had great directors, terrific lineup of folks coming to give specific addresses, and then you had a lot of good participants. So there was rich conversation in the seminars and a rich fellowship outside of it. And Bill organized near the end of we were there
6 weeks.
6 week, 5 or 6
Wow.
weeks. So the last week we had a grand celebration where Bill played the piano.
That's true, right? Yeah.
Huh.
So
See,
that
his
other part of his
idea,
personality.
Bill's idea was, I was teaching at Calvin, and I didn't have any trouble finding people to talk to about Christian philosophy or how to do philosophy as a Christian. And I didn't have anybody sort of criticizing me or looking down their nose at me where I was for doing what I wanted to do. But he was thinking all the time about people who weren't at places like Calvin. And he was thinking about people at University of Michigan or University of Illinois, where he taught for a while, and various other places. And if there were any Christian philosophers, they would, for the most part, feel very isolated, very much alone, and it's hard even to realize that there are other Christian philosophers around. And also, there weren't that many in those days, many fewer than there are now. So his idea was that those people really needed help and support. And that's why he was so keen on starting the Society of Christian Philosophers, and why he was so keen on having something like that Bellingham conference.
And there are other ways in which, so I'm teaching at Ouachita. There's 2 people in the department only. One of whom has gotten a degree a long time ago, is not really very much into the kinds of conversations that are being nurtured by the Society of Christian Philosophers. So even though I'm at a Christian university, I still don't have a lot of people to talk to. Bill Haskers is at a small college.
Right. Mm-hmm.
He's a one-person or two-person department. He doesn't have very many people to talk to. So, I mean, at Calvin, it's really an interesting situation when you've got 10, 12 philosophers in the department. That's really an exception, not the rule among Christian colleges and universities. So you might be a Christian at a Christian college and still feel isolated. So this conference brought together a lot of different kinds of folks from a lot of different circumstances, but I think almost all of them shared, one, this excitement about what was going on, in large part because of what Bill and Al and others had done in putting the Society of Christian Philosophers together. And now you're beginning to have these national and regional meetings. And I think Bill was right. This conference was another way of giving this real energy. And that's how I experienced it and others. We went there and we had a terrific 5 or 6 weeks, and we went back to our own institutions, inspired and edified.
And so now that gets us to the late 80s, and in 1990, when I graduated from high school, just a few years after basically that was right when I was entering high school, the Bellingham conference was, and then 1990 I go to seminary at Liberty University. Eleanor Stump at this point is teaching at Virginia Tech. She has Alvin Plantinga in for a lecture. I drive up there, pretend to be a graduate student at Virginia Tech, and get into this discussion. And at that point, the lecture was on. He had parts of the manuscript of Warranted Christian Belief, and that I still have to this day. And so I dropped out of seminary and went back to the University of Missouri, but I took with me some ideas and attitudes that are directly descended from all of this. And then throughout the 90s, as the Warrant books were published, as Swinburne's tetralogy on Christian philosophy came out, as I was going through my undergraduate career as a philosopher and cramming 4 years into 6.5, during that 6.5 year period when in the 90s, when all of these books were coming out, I was able to defend the faith confidently in the class, or in a way that was just so nourished by these books that were written by people who had come out of this tradition, who had been fed here and started there. And it really is just, when you follow the trajectory, and then now here I am at Baylor with, working with wonderful colleagues and wonderful faculty colleagues and wonderful graduate student colleagues, trying to just channel as best I can and pass on the baton that has been continually handed down. It gives me a sense of mission for that, and I hope that our graduate students will go out with that same sense of mission and calling to what they do when they leave Baylor. So what we're going to do now is we're going to pause for a second, change the tape and the recorder, and then we're going to go to your guys' questions. So let's thank our panelists for their. Okay, I will take a cue, fallibalistically, so don't get upset if it doesn't work out perfectly. And did you want to tell this just off the top of your head, or?
Well, I thought I might. One other thing that you might say, I think, is part of the history that's important. And that is the Faith and Rationality Project that Al and Nick and George Mavrodis and Bill Alston did in '84. I think that was really important in giving a kind of spark to this intellectual renaissance. But I will say one little funny anecdote, just to show that these giants were not always right about everything. Just a couple of years before this project got off the ground, I was having dinner with Nick Wolterstorff at an APA, and I asked Nick, I said, well, as a young, what should I be working on, Nick? And he said, don't waste your time on epistemology. Nothing interesting there. And a couple of years later, he was working on...
Well, when he studied epistemology at Harvard, it wasn't very interesting. It was all about the problem of the speckled hen, and I don't know if you know that problem or not. But, you've got sense data, and then the question is whether, given a sense datum, you can be aware of all of its features, or whether the sense datum could have features such as your work, you couldn't really detect them just by having the sense datum. And so the idea is, well, you might have a sense datum of a speckled hen, and you wouldn't be able to tell just how many speckles there were. Well, he didn't think that was very worthwhile.
Yeah. I've got several papers on this. Okay, Todd, Dr. Buras.
So my experience of the narrative that's been articulated here is very much like what Trent described. Coming into a stream that was really cresting and gaining enormous momentum and really being inspired by it.
You're talking about your own personal
Yeah.
experience. So
Yeah.
say when you were,
Yeah,
when
so
you're talking
roughly
about.
the same time, like mid-90s, I was in grad school, and the spate of books that had now been in print since, starting somewhere in the mid-70s to mid-80s with especially the Faith and Rationality book. I studied that one as an undergrad, devoured it, in fact. So I had a very similar experience. So I wanted my first word to be one of admiration and thanks, especially, I think Steve and Mike know of my admiration and thanks, but especially to Dr. Plantinga. But I did have a question as well. So second word is a question. I wonder if you could capture in your own thinking about the narrative, to what extent the community that was forming around the Society of Christian Philosophy and around these seminar events like the Bellingham event, to what extent it was a conscious part of your efforts both to support extremely excellent work among yourselves and to help stimulate in the smaller colleges out there truly excellent philosophy. I know by the time I came along, that was a really strong and important thing as I was encountering the discipline of philosophy, was to do work that was just lived up to the standards that generation had set in terms of just unqualified excellent philosophy. So it's something you did, and I wonder how, to what extent you meant to do it.
I wasn't myself very conscious of any world historical movements or anything of the kind. It was these things look like movements or assume more unity in retrospect, I think, than at the time. And I didn't think that Christian philosophers weren't doing really excellent philosophy, and I was going to try to change that or anything like that. For me, it was just kind of doing what seemed like the sensible thing to do at the moment and following my interest. It wasn't like planning any kind of long-term project with lots of people involved in it. None of that was really the way it actually was. I mean, it looks more like that maybe in retrospect, but it wasn't that way in fact.
But you do, Alston's part, there was a lot of intentionality behind, the purpose behind the community aspects.
Right.
And it's also no accident that people doing excellent work fell together as friends and comrades. Surely part of your personal relationship with Waltersdorf is related to your estimation of the quality of his work.
Well, yeah, I think he does really great work. Absolutely. Yeah, right. But it wasn't like he thought or I thought we've got to raise the level of intellectual excellence on the part of Christian philosophers.
Well, there wasn't much there to raise, though, at that point, right? I mean,
no, it was not. It wasn't like that. It was more, and this is more in connection with Alston. Christian philosophers need to have a way to get together. They need to feel support from other Christian philosophers, and they need to gain more self-confidence, and they've got to feel that they're not, one person against a whole raft of other people like that. They have to have this kind of mutual understanding and supporting each other. That was an important part of it, but not the stuff about excellence. We all just we did what we could.
I think that that kind of thinking and that kind of intentionality maybe came from the more evangelical wing of this, because those were the people who'd come out of schools that a lot of them were not very good. And they were aware of the need to raise the bar and raise the standard of excellence. And there was also, my own mentor, Arthur Holmes, had a dream when he started teaching at Wheaton in the early 50s. He wanted to send 100 Christian students into philosophy. That was his dream and his goal. And I think he pretty much succeeded in that. Calvin probably did that and more without having to sit down and make it a goal. They just did it.
Yeah.
But I think in Art's case, it had to be formulated as a kind of a goal. And I'll just give you another example. And sometimes it's helpful, I think, to compare what happens in philosophy with other areas. The other area where I think there's been a tremendous renaissance of Christian thinking is in history. We can see that in lots of places. And if you look at the historians, the evangelicals like Mark Knoll, they were thinking strategically and intentionally. They were thinking in terms of what can we do to, so to speak, establish some kind of community of Christian historians who are both committed Christians who take their faith seriously but who are excellent historians. And I think there was intentionality there, but again, the impetus for that, I think, came out of more of the evangelicals.
Yeah. I'm not going to correct you, of course, but I do want to ask you to elaborate, especially because what you should have said was about the role of the Calvin colloquium.
Oh,
And
yeah.
There's a part of the story, especially I want the undergrads here to hear about, because I think it fleshes out the lore of the movement a bit. But say a bit about the role of the Calvin colloquium,
Yeah.
which I know it impacted your work as well at some point, Steve.
Yeah, well, the Calvin colloquium started basically when I went to Calvin in 1963 or so. And I had come from Wayne, which, as I said, was fundamentally one large discussion group. And I found that really extremely useful, naturally. And I thought the same thing, something like that should go on at Calvin. So we started having a colloquium every Tuesday afternoon. And this colloquium still goes on now. So, I mean, this was 50 years ago, or nearly 50 years ago that it started. And most of in the early days especially, of the work that Calvin philosophers did, that Nick did or I did or others did, went through this colloquium, which was a 2-hour session of looking at the work in question extremely carefully, line by line, finding whatever you could by way of something that was an infelicity and could be corrected and could be improved. And the idea was to improve these things, not to shoot them down, as philosophers sometimes are likely to do, but actually to see if you can't really help, make this thing better than it is now. And that went on all the time. I remember my first book, God and Other Minds, got that kind of line-by-line treatment and was vastly better as a result. Yeah. Yeah. When I first came to Calvin, and we started this, there weren't very many of us philosophers there then. There was Cliff Orlebeck, and there was a man named H. Evan Runner, some of you might have heard of. Runner came once, but he didn't like what we were doing very much. He was a follower of Vollenhoven and Dooyeweerd from the Netherlands, and we weren't doing it that way. And then there was an older guy named Tunis Prince. He was a generation or so older than Nick and myself. And Nick and I were young and extremely serious about philosophy, dead earnest, deadly serious about philosophy. And Tunis Prince took a much more relaxed view of philosophy and a much more relaxed view of Nick and me than Nick and I took of ourselves. And so in those days, as in these, the idea was to try to integrate faith and learning, integrate faith and philosophy, put the two together somehow. I mean, that was a Kuyperian idea. So one of these things, I was working on the verifiability criterion of meaning. And in my book, God and Other Minds, this is that way back then, I had a section on the verifiability criterion of meaning, VC1, VC2, VC3, none of which worked. So, there were about, I don't know, maybe 8 VCs or 8 or 10, and I'd argue in each case they didn't work. Well, Tunis Prince listened to all this a little impatiently, and he said, finally, when we were done, he said, well, you want to integrate faith and learning, right? Well, you know how to do that? You go through all those VCs like you did, and then when you get to the end, you say, and there is none that doeth good. No, not one. So he wasn't that serious about our colloquium, but actually the colloquium was an enormous benefit, right? And I recommend it to you for sure.
Alex?
This is actually another Todd Buras question. But Tom persuaded me it's interesting. So what connection is there between this story and the tradition of philosophy as done at Catholic schools in the U.S. for a long time, the American Catholic Philosophical Association, which was founded in 1926? Was there any connection? Was there hostility? Was there synergy?
As far as I know, there was no connection at all in the early days, and not hostility. There was just no contact. Catholic philosophers, for the most part, did their own thing. They had their own subjects, and these subjects didn't overlap much with what Protestant philosophers were doing, or other philosophers. And so there just wasn't any contact. It wasn't really till I got to Notre Dame that there started to be a certain amount of contact, of working together and the like. But early on there wasn't, and it wasn't because of any hostility. It was like two separate worlds.
All right, some non-Baylor faculty member question. Yeah, Cameron?
As for Dr. Plantinga, you mentioned how you and some of the other people that talked about who started sort of movement that you can only really see sort of retrogressively, as you weren't really aware of it at the time of what exactly it was doing. You weren't really conscious of trying to start this Christian movement or something. On the other side of the coin, you mentioned that a lot of Christian philosophers weren't very open or outspoken about their faith, but in your experience, how many of them were sort of treated with hostility as opposed to sort of just indifference, or like in your anecdote, just sort of like a joking or something?
Well, there was in those days, in the 1950s and 60s, there wasn't. I mean, Christian philosophers didn't, if they were in sort of secular context, would just sort of keep their Christianity under their hats. If they didn't, they would be often subject to a certain amount of ridicule and disapprobation, and thinking this isn't what philosophy is like, and a real philosopher shouldn't be think these ways and the like of that. There was a lot of that, and there still is now too, to some degree. Yeah. But what struck me about all this was that it didn't seem to me the proper reaction on the part of Christian philosophers should be to go underground. I mean, so some people don't like your being a Christian philosopher. Well, okay, I mean, that's the way life is. That doesn't mean you have to sort of hide your light, if that's what it is, under a bushel or anything like that,
And not even just Christian philosophers, but the discussion of philosophy and religion more generally. So Roderick Chisholm was very knowledgeable in Christian philosophy, but he was not himself a Christian,
Right,
or even
yeah.
a theist that I know. He might have ended something like a theist. But you told me an anecdote one time about you guys discussing at Wayne State. Can you?
Well, you mean about the time that I was having lunch with him and Norman Malcolm?
Yeah.
Yeah. So these two guys, they were eminent philosophers, both of them, Malcolm and Chisholm, highly regarded. And Malcolm actually turned out to be a Christian later on, at least. And Chisholm wasn't, but he had a lot of sympathy towards theism. And I remember having lunch with these guys, and they're saying that they had to be careful about keeping these sympathies under their hats, because otherwise there was, I don't know, disapprobation that would not be good for your reputation, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's not. So that's beyond just being a Christian in your own. It's just even the discussion of these as legitimate topics was still not. And one version of the story, I think you told me one time, Chisholm sort of like looked around. Was it?
Yeah, he did, right. He's to look around to see if anybody's listening to him.
Well, one anecdote from my grad school days, I took a seminar from a Polish logician who was a student of G.E. Moore's named Casimir Louis. And he was, the whole seminar was about very difficult questions in semantic theory and how translated expression should be symbolized in logic and things like that. And Louis was a kind of Platonist, and he was arguing for and defending Platonic views of meaning and reference. And there were several profs who were auditing this course because they thought highly of this guy. And at one point, one of them stood up and in just an incredulous voice said, "But don't you realize if you say that, that commits you to Platonism?" And Louis turned around and he just threw his chalk and he said, "No one wants to be a Platonist. It's like believing in God. You wouldn't admit it if it were true. But what do you do if the logical facts drive you there?"
I have a similar anecdote that ties in an important way, I think. So in my, when I was an undergrad, I took a graduate seminar in modal logic and formal logic. And my prof, who's a very strong naturalist, presented a version of the ontological argument as a paradox. Its seeming validity was presented as a paradox. Like, look, it looks like it's a valid argument with true premises, but yet it proves an obviously false conclusion. And that was, he was making that sort of, that was his attitude. But I was able, because I had read Al's edited volume on the ontological argument, on the history of the ontological argument, because I had read Al's articles on it, because I had read The Nature of Necessity, I was able to interact in that discussion in a way that demanded a hearing. I mean, and it was obvious that I knew what I was talking about, not because I had discovered anything. I had done a careful reading of Dr. Plantinga's work, and in that moment in that class where belief in God was mocked as obviously irrational, that moment was transformed into a moment where he had to admit certain facts about the good properties of this argument. And that's a concrete way in which I was able in the 90s to draw upon work that these guys brought out much earlier, and without that I would have, because I'm not the kind of guy who could have ever thought of that stuff on my own, and so without that pioneering work, that moment would have just gone completely to the atheist side. Yeah, over here.
Yeah, so as a grad student, I sometimes wonder what I'm doing with my life, right?
You'd rather be climbing, right?
Right. So one of the things that I think about a lot is, I'm really excited to be doing philosophy and to get to think about issues that I think are important. And then I also think about, okay, so I'm also a Christian, and I wonder how those two things interact. So, and I wanted to know whether you had any thoughts on what you think the Christian philosopher's role is in serving the church.
Can you repeat the question?
Sorry? Oh, yeah. Dan's question was something like, what do I think the role of the Christian philosopher is with respect to the church? And I think that's a really good thing to think about. I think that's an important question, very important question. And my own view, which, just my own view, I think Christian philosophers should think of themselves perhaps primarily as philosophers of the Christian church, as part of the whole Christian community. So by Christian church, I mean the whole Christian community. I would include Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox, and maybe you could even add in Muslims and Jews and the like. But at any rate, I think a Christian philosopher's first loyalty is to that community and not to, say, the American Philosophical Association or the community of philosophers in general. And the ways in which a philosopher can be of use to that community is, there are several ways. For one thing, there in contemporary life, in contemporary American culture, and not just American culture, culture in Europe as well, there are all kinds of powerful expressions, especially from the elite, intellectual elites and other kinds of elites as well, against Christian beliefs, seeing it as foolish or silly or fundamentalist or in some way dumb. I mean, you've got New York, not too many Christians there, the West Coast, not too many, but in between there's this vast wasteland where people take Christianity seriously and the like. And I think that attitude, the presence of that attitude, the prevalence of it, I think is problematic for Christians. So lots of Christians start believing this. They start feeling like they're inferior, or their Christianity is inferior, or being serious about it is. And it's an important part of the function of the Christian philosophical community to actively oppose this, and oppose it with confidence and with confidence and without sort of apologizing for it or anything like that. To point out that for the most part, this stuff is just nothing to be said for it. For example, now there are the dreaded four horsemen of atheism, with their sort of loud brayings on all these topics, but they're just a kind of extreme example. There's a whole lot more of this in state universities all over, non-Christian universities all over, and I mean, I think there's an important role there. One very important role for Christian philosophers is to combat this, or to show the Christian community that there's not much to be said for this. A lot of this is just kind of empty posturing, as it is with, say, Dawkins and Dennett and Harris and Hitchens, of course, but then lots of others as well.
Yeah, John?
So, follow-up to that, what do you think of as the relation between Christian philosophy and apologetics?
Well, I would think
So the question is the relationship between Christian philosophy and apologetics.
I would think of Christian philosophy as consisting in several parts. One part would be apologetics, both positive apologetics and negative. So what I was just now mentioning was sort of like negative apologetics, or maybe like another part which you could call cultural criticism. So I'd say apologetics, both positive and negative, and philosophical theology, thinking about such questions as the relation of God and time and divine simplicity and things of that sort. And then cultural criticism, sort of looking at wide cultural ideas that are widespread in the environment. The idea, for example, that really the proper way to fix one's beliefs is to accept whatever current science says. Maybe it'll turn out to be wrong, but that's the rational, the reasonable thing to do. And then finally, the fourth part would be what you could call positive Christian philosophy, which would be a matter of looking at specific philosophical questions, the kinds that philosophers have been asking and answering, well, ever since the pre-Socratics, from an explicitly Christian perspective. See if this casts any light on them, see if being a Christian is relevant in one way or another. So I would think of apologetics as one part then, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is for anyone. I was wondering if you could say something about what you see as being the particularly important issues for for the next generation, the next 30 years in philosophy of religion? Say anything about that?
Yeah, what do you think, Steve?
I think it's always very difficult to be a prophet and predict
Right.
what's going to be.
Dang it!
I do think I worry myself about what we might call the big shoes that are being left by Bill Alston, and looking at the community right now, we have many more Christian philosophers than we had when I came out of graduate school. And many of them are very, very well-trained, smart, excellent people. But I don't always sense the same sense of wisdom and perspective and a sense of what's really important in providing sort of intellectual leadership for the community. So I'm hoping we will have people who will be sensitive to what are the issues, the questions that are important. It's not clear to me that I could sit here today and say what's going to be on the agenda 10 years from now or 15 years from now. But I think I'll say this, in my view, we have to have a balance between, so to speak, being part of the current conversation, sort of knowing what's going on, being able to say things about that if it's important, but not being a slave to what the philosophical world. We as a Christian community we should have some of our own questions and issues, which may or may not be au courant or what the rest of the profession wants to talk about. So there's something of a balance, I think, needed. We can't withdraw into a ghetto and just talk to ourselves, so we have to be engaged in conversation with what the issues are. But I think it is very healthy not always to accept the terms of a debate or an argument the way it's going on right now. For example, I just finished a book in metaethics, and I'm not convinced that the distinction that is commonly made in ethics between internalism and externalism is a healthy or promising way to think about the issues. And so sometimes I think we have to step back and ask ourselves if the debate that's going on now is framed in the best way, whether the questions being asked are the right, the way the issues are being categorized is.
Let me respond to it. It's on a similar theme, but if you ask the question, what are Christian philosophers to be thinking about, or what will they be thinking about 10, 15, 20 years from now? On the one hand, I think what's remarkable about Al and his generation is that when he's going through graduate school, in the philosophical community in particular, but in the academy in general, there's this notion that religion isn't very substantive. I mean, there's not much to it. And if you're really smart, you're going to give it up. That's why people in the wasteland maybe eventually will get smart and they'll give it up too, like folks have on the East and the West Coast. And it had a particular version in the philosophical community. I mean, the notion that religious language was empty in some sense, was just nonsense. And so what Al does is to show that the most familiar ways of trying to defend that view among philosophers is itself empty. It doesn't go anywhere. So using their own criterion, he shows that there's nothing to this. And he's done this over and over again, right? But there's it's not there are times in philosophy when we churn away at issues that are maybe interesting for their own sake, but they don't have much broader significance. In this case, we're talking about a cultural phenomenon of real significance that Al and others are able to show philosophically. There's nothing to it. And that has great cultural significance and is a part of the impetus for what's going on now. Well, when I think about it that way, one of the issues that comes to mind to me is how most people think about morality. What a number of studies have shown, and among those are Christian Smith at the University of Notre Dame, is that most teenagers, and even, they've got a name for this, I can't remember what it is, but people who are age 17 to 24.
Moralistic therapeutic deism.
Well, that's the view, moralistic therapeutic deists, but they call this group, they're not teenagers, but they're
Emerging adults.
emerging adults. That's like emerging larva or something, I don't know. Anyway, you know, but even this group tends to think that morality is just a matter of your own subjective view about what's right and wrong. And that's certainly inconsistent with how Christians have thought about it. It seems to me how they ought to think about it. And yet, it's culturally widespread. You ask yourself, how is it that our children, our teenagers, and the emerging adults, where did they come up with these ideas? It might be that it's in our churches, in our homes, and it's certainly in the culture. Mm-hmm. So, how are we philosophers supposed to respond to that? What is it that we have to say about it? To me, that's a very important issue because it has so many implications. And from our notions about morality to social responsibility to how we think about the community. And it seems to me it's also certainly I agree with Al that it seems to me really important for Christian philosophers not to think of themselves as Lone Ranger. Christians are Lone Ranger philosophers. We are wed to the church.
I will say one issue that has emerged and is already recognized as important, and I think is going to continue to be important for the foreseeable future, and maybe especially important for Christians in philosophy, and that is the role of what we might call character or virtues in seeing the truth. I think the tendency in contemporary philosophy is to emphasize technical expertise, which is important. And Aristotle, of course, famously said that if you haven't been brought up properly, don't even try to do ethics. You won't get very far. And I think we need to think more about what does it mean to be wise. What are the intellectual virtues as well as the other virtues? What are you might say, the characteristics that people need to have besides being smart and besides knowing how to think your way around an argument? What are the other characteristics that we need to have if we're going to make progress in gaining knowledge and truth? So connecting, you might say, the practice of philosophy to character formation, spiritual formation, I think these are things that ought to be on our agenda.
Do you want to add anything to that, Al?
I'd like to add something that's not quite exactly on that topic, but so I was saying, and Mike was saying that Christian philosophers should think of themselves perhaps primarily as members of the Christian community and not primarily as members of the APA or the American philosophical community. On the other hand, it's also, Christian philosophers are also and should be part of the philosophical community. It's not like the right way to do things is for Christian philosophers just to stick together and not even talk to the rest of the world, which is sort of what Catholic philosophers did for a stretch of time in there, at least. I don't think that's what they should do at all. They should be very self-consciously part of the general philosophical community too. So it's like a Christian philosopher, the Christian philosophical community. People are members of several different communities. I mean, you're a member of you're a Christian. You're a member of the Christian Church. You're a philosopher. You're a member of so part of the whole community of philosophers. you're a member of the Christian community of Christian philosophers, Christian academics of whatever sort, and the like. There's a whole series of overlapping communities. And Christian philosophers, and philosophers generally, as far as that goes, have to know when they're addressing which ones of these, you know. So if you're giving a talk at the APA, you don't sort of take it for granted that Christian Trinitarianism is true. You can't, wouldn't produce an argument where that was the first premise or something like that. I mean, that would be totally inappropriate. So Christians have to be sort of wise, and Christian philosophers have to know who they're talking to, you know, and what way you talk, what way you properly, relevantly talk will depend in part on which sort of, which community it is that you're addressing. Right.
So I know there are more questions out there, but I want to have time for a little more informal discussion. You can certainly, there'll be a little bit of time to address those questions within the basically reception format, but we need to transition into that. And before thanking the panelists, I just want to note that one natural way to think about how we ought to approach the future in light of the work that these guys have done in the past is to take more risks, because we don't have to lay the foundations. The foundations have been laid. The first floor has been built quite nicely. I think that when that sort of work has been done, it's time to take some greater risks, whatever that means in terms of what one does with one's writing and what one's maybe willing to say. So let's transition into the reception mode and thank our panelists.